Cutting through cloud and pitch blackness, a FlyDubai Boeing 737 makes its final approach. As fierce winds batter the plane, the pilots struggle to keep track of the runway. The passengers hold on tight as the aircraft bucks and sways. But moments from landing, the pilots get a warning that ahead of them lies deadly wind shear. What happens next is a scene of sheer chaos and confusion. This is the story of FlyDubai 981. Late in the evening on March 18, 2016, 55 passengers and 7 crew boarded a Boeing 737-800 at Dubai International Airport. They were bound for Rostov-on-Don in Russia, a 4.5-hour journey. Most of the passengers were Russian citizens, heading home from a package holiday organised by a large Russian tour operator. There were also 8 Ukrainians on board, 2 passengers from India and 1 from Uzbekistan. Up front in the cockpit were 2 pilots. The captain was a 37-year-old Cypriot named Aristos Socrates. He was relatively experienced, with just short of 6,000 hours of flying time, most of which were on the 737. He had flown for many different airlines in his career, with a stint at Helios Airways from 2004 until it shut down in 2006 following the crash of one of its 737s, which I've covered on the channel. He also flew for UK-based XL Airways between 2006 and 2008, and Malaysian Airlines from 2011 to 2012. He had begun working for FlyDubai 2 years previously in 2012. Socrates had recently accepted a job at Ryanair, which would allow him to return to live with his family in Cyprus. He was just days away from his final flight with FlyDubai. Before we get any further, I want to thank this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. I've really been enjoying getting into my family history lately, and with MyHeritage, I've been able to discover so much more about where I come from. It's been fascinating adding people to my family tree, and then seeing that a distant relative has been doing the same thing, meaning that our trees then connect, with loads of gaps filled in that I didn't even know about. This is made even easier by the use of the Instant Discoveries feature, where you can simply click a button and discover whole new branches of your family tree, which have been filled out by relatives of yours. There are some really interesting features, like the ability to upload old black and white photos and watch them become colour photos. Here's a picture of my granddad with some friends, taken sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and it's incredible to see it come to life in colour for the first time. If you want to dig a little deeper into your roots, you can also check census and voter records. I found it fascinating to see that while my second name is pretty uncommon in Ireland, where I'm from, there are hundreds of people in the US with the name in the 1940 census there. Here's Frank Fierick, a 34-year-old accountant living in New York with his wife and son and daughter in the year 1940. The amount of information and useful tools at your fingertips here means that you're only really limited by your own curiosity and your desire to connect with your roots. If you want to discover more about who you are, you can start with MyHeritage and get 14 days free using my link below. The first officer was 1 year younger than the captain, and he had a similar amount of flying experience, just shy of 6,000 hours, over 1,000 of which were on the 737-800. He had flown a wide variety of aircraft with different airlines in this time, including the ATR-72 and the Airbus A320, before joining FlyDubai to fly the 737 2 years previously. Both pilots had good flying records. However, a number of deficiencies were noted during their recent biannual recurrent training and checks at FlyDubai. We'll have a look at these and see why they're relevant for this flight in a moment. These 2 pilots had never flown together before, and it was each of their first times flying to Rostov. While perhaps not an ideal pairing, airline procedures are made in such a way that the pilots are interchangeable parts in the system, meaning that although pairings like this can pose challenges, they are not unsafe. But an additional challenge was posed on this flight by some variables which were specific to their destination airport of Rostov-on-Don. Rostov had an unusually shallow glide path, just 2.67 degrees instead of the usual 3. As well as this, crews were advised to expect turbulence and wind shear on final approach. Owing to these difficulties, the airport had been designated by FlyDubai as a captains-only airport, meaning, as the name suggests, that only captains could fly the aircraft in and out, while first officers acted as pilot monitoring. What's more, flying into Russia in general involves a number of differences which flight crew need to be aware of. These include that altitudes are measured in meters rather than feet, requiring pilots to use conversion tables, presenting another source of possible errors. On top of this, Russian controllers tell pilots to reference their altimeters to airport elevation and not sea level, as it is in most of the world. These differences would be new to the first officer, as he had never flown into Russia before, whereas the captain had been there 14 times. When the flight had been loaded with baggage, passengers, and about 17 tons of fuel, it was finally ready to depart. This amount of fuel was far more than what was needed for the journey, but that's because fuel in Dubai was cheaper than fuel in Rostov, so it actually made more sense for the airline to uplift enough at Dubai for the return journey as well, rather than to buy more once it got to Rostov. This is known as tankering. Slightly behind schedule, Flight 981 pushed back from its gate at Dubai. The first officer would be flying the leg to Rostov, with the captain taking over as they neared the airport. He carefully manoeuvred the plane around the complex web of taxiways at Dubai, and after a 17-minute taxi, lined up on the departure runway and set takeoff thrust. Within moments, the plane roared into the sky and headed out over the Persian Gulf. It was a calm night, and the first officer hand flew the plane up to 2,700 feet before engaging the autopilot. The plane followed the magenta path on the navigation display, turning north towards Russia. While conditions were pleasant in Dubai, things were not looking so good at Rostov. It was windy, visibility was poor, and it was raining. There was also severe turbulence brewing in the area. These would not be the most welcoming conditions for the crew's first time landing into the airport. But as bad as these conditions were, they were still within safe limits. So, Flight 981 continued en route as planned. Just about 20 minutes after takeoff, the flight had reached its cruising altitude of flight level 360, or about 36,000 feet. As per standard operating procedure at FlyDubai, the captain was using his heads-up display, or HUD. This is a transparent piece of glass onto which is projected information from the primary flight display, this instrument here. The purpose of the HUD is to make it possible for the pilots to both look outside and see their instruments at the same time. It's especially useful during approach and landing, as it enables pilots to simply look straight ahead rather than continuously switching their gaze between their instruments and the outside. For example, even without looking down at his instruments, the captain could see at this moment that he was flying at flight level 360, that his indicated speed was about 260 knots, and that he was on a heading of 323 degrees. He could also see much more information, including which autopilot modes were engaged, the plane's angle of attack, and even the current winds. The HUD is a helpful tool, and while it was first developed for fighter jets, it is now becoming more common on passenger airliners. In the cabin, the flight progressed normally, as the plane continued north over Iran. The passengers were served meals and drinks, and because there were just 55 passengers, this meant that the service was carried out quickly. In just a few short hours, they thought, they would be on the ground in Rostov. An hour and 20 minutes after reaching cruising altitude, the captain took over as pilot flying. He would fly the descent and approach into Rostov, while the first officer monitored the aircraft. A few minutes later, when passing a reporting point called Lapto, the captain contacted the Rostov area controller and asked for the latest weather information. The controller gave him the bad news. The wind was 17 knots, gusting to 29, or about 54 kilometers per hour. There were rain showers, a low cloud ceiling, and, as the pilots learned a few minutes later, a SIGMET was in force. SIGMET stands for Significant Meteorological Information. It's issued when there are any weather conditions which pose a danger to flights. This particular SIGMET, which the controller passed on to the pilots, said that there was severe turbulence from the Earth's surface up to flight level 150, or about 15,000 feet. Severe turbulence is rare enough that you've probably never flown through it in your life, even if you fly a lot. It's turbulence which is so strong that pilots can temporarily lose control of the aircraft. Wanting to avoid this, the pilots asked the controller where in particular the severe turbulence was. The controller told them that it applied to almost the entire area covered by the weather chart. Not the best news. However, on the bright side, no aircraft so far that night had reported experiencing it. As they began planning their descent, the pilots of Flight 981 hoped that they would have the same luck. The captain briefed the approach into Rostov, and once he was finished, the first officer requested descent clearance from air traffic control. They were cleared down to flight level 190, about 19,000 feet. A key thing they needed to be ready for on the approach was wind shear. Wind shear is a sudden change in the speed or direction of the wind, and it is one of the most feared phenomena encountered by pilots. The Boeing 737's weather radar can detect wind shear ahead of the plane by measuring sharp changes in the direction or speed of water droplets. This gives pilots advanced warning of a wind shear encounter, allowing them to climb to safety before they enter it. It also has, as a last resort, a wind shear detection system which tells the pilots when they have already entered wind shear. Pilots are trained to react differently to each of these warnings, but what they have in common is that an immediate go-round is required. As the crew descended through flight level 220, the first officer asked for further descent clearance. The controller handed him off to approach control, who then cleared the plane down to flight level 60, about 6,000 feet. The pilots were now beginning to encounter the clouds and turbulence that the weather forecast had predicted. Before long, Flight 981 was approaching flight level 60 and beginning to slow down. They were now just minutes from landing. The controller cleared them to descend further, and the captain set an altitude of 3,300 feet on the autopilot, corresponding to 1,000 meters. A few minutes later, the pilots were cleared to intercept the instrument landing system for runway 22 at Rostov. Once cleared, they were handed off to the tower controller. The pilots began configuring the aircraft for landing, extending the flaps and slowing the plane down further. They had now reached their cleared altitude of 800 meters or 2,600 feet. In Russia, pilots are given air pressure settings which tell them their height above the airport rather than their height above sea level, as it is in most of the world. So when the controller told the pilots that the pressure setting on their instruments should be 990 hectopascals in order for their altimeters to read zero at the airport, the pilots should have put 1000 hectopascals on their instruments, as per the conversion tables provided to them by the airline. The difference in displayed altitude between 990 hectopascals and 1000 hectopascals is 280 feet. On this flight, because the pilots had incorrectly set a pressure of 990 hectopascals on their instruments, this meant that they were 280 feet off their assigned altitude. Luckily for them, they were 280 feet higher than they were supposed to be, rather than lower. So, as long as they continued to make this mistake in this direction, this shouldn't have been a problem. The controller cleared Flight 981 to land, and told the pilots that the wind was blowing from 240 degrees, almost straight down the runway, at a speed of 21 knots, gusting to 29 knots. These winds were strong, but they were still well within the limits of what the pilots could handle. As long as wind shear didn't rear its ugly head, this would be more or less a routine landing. Still on autopilot, the plane intercepted the localizer and began turning in towards the runway. Shortly after, it captured the glide slope and began descending. At this point, the captain told the first officer to set 2,300 feet on the autopilot, the altitude they would climb to if they had to carry out a go-round. This detail will turn out to be important in a moment. The pilots continued slowing down, deploying more flaps and then lowering the gear. They would be using 30 degrees of flaps for landing. For its weight and flap setting, they needed to fly at an approach speed of 140 knots. But in the windy conditions, it wouldn't be safe to fly right at this speed, as a gust from behind could dramatically reduce the plane's airspeed. As a result, the pilots calculated a safety margin, which they would add to the plane's airspeed. This calculation was based on half the stable wind component of 20 knots, which was 10 knots, plus the full value of the gusts, which was 8 knots. This adds up to a correction factor of 18 knots. So, the approach speed needed to be 140 knots plus 18 knots, 158 knots, in order to give the plane sufficient margin above stall speed. But for whatever reason, the pilots didn't calculate the winds this way. Instead, they added just 10 knots, almost half the factor they should have had. This speed, 150 knots, is what they dialed into the autopilot. Things were now starting to get bumpy. The passengers were straining against their seats as the plane shook, its wings flexing up and down. The pilots had their shoulder harnesses on, keeping them in place so that they could handle the controls. The captain was monitoring the plane's approach through his heads-up display, while the first officer double-checked that everything was within limits. The autopilot was flying the plane perfectly. It had the flight path symbol here, which shows the actual path of the plane through space, centered right on the guidance cue here, which shows the pilot, or in this case the autopilot, where to put the flight path symbol. As the plane descended, the turbulence got worse. This was the low-level turbulence the pilots had been warned about on their charts. The whole plane started to shake and buffet. Now just a few minutes from landing, the captain disconnected the autopilot and began flying manually. The automation had been flying the plane just fine, but there was a risk that if the captain disconnected the autopilot very shortly before landing, he wouldn't have long enough to get a feel for the plane in the conditions before touching down. Now, the captain was doing what the autopilot had been doing moments ago, placing the flight path symbol inside the guidance cue. And he was doing a good job of it. Before long, the plane had burst out of the bottom of the cloud layer, and the runway came into view 7 kilometers ahead. But just seconds later, as the plane descended through 1,100 feet, its weather radar detected a rapid change in the wind direction ahead of the plane. An automated voice in the cockpit shouted out,
"Windshear ahead! Windshear ahead!"
The captain responded immediately to this warning, slamming the thrust levers to their forward stop and pulling the plane's nose up. The plane accelerated rapidly, and everyone on board was pushed into their seats. As the engines roared to full power, their position below the plane's center of gravity caused them to swing the plane's nose up. To counteract this and stop the nose from rising further, the captain actually had to push his control column forward. The altitude the pilots needed to climb to, as per the go-around procedure, was 2,300 feet. With full thrust, a light aircraft, and with only 1,200 feet to climb from their current altitude, the pilots would reach this very quickly. More quickly, in fact, than they were prepared for. This wasn't just a normal go-round the captain was carrying out, but the windshear escape maneuver, hence the use of full thrust, and the fact that the pilots kept the gear and flaps extended. The whole purpose of this is to get the plane away from the ground as quickly as possible. In the middle of the maneuver, the first officer, at the captain's instruction, notified the controller that they were going around. This took his attention away from the all-important task of monitoring the plane's flight path. During these crucial seconds, with the engines still at full power, the airspeed continued to increase rapidly. If the pilots didn't do something about this quickly, they would expose the flaps to powerful aerodynamic forces, possibly damaging them. At the same time, the captain was eager not to burst through the go-round altitude of 2,300 feet, so he continued pushing forward on his control column, trying to get the plane's nose down to slow the rapid climb. A significant amount of force was required to do this. To help reduce the force required, the captain used the trim switches to move the horizontal stabilizer itself. With this, the plane's nose slowly started to drop. But the more it did, the more the aircraft sped up. The captain needed to stop accelerating. The first officer told him to watch his airspeed, and he acknowledged this, but he didn't pull the thrust levers back from their forward stop. Still pitching down and accelerating, the plane was now rapidly approaching the overspeed limit for the flaps, which were hanging down into the oncoming airflow at 175 knots, or over 320 km per hour. This was too much for them to take. The flaps automatically retracted from 30 degrees to 25 degrees, a safety feature built in by Boeing. By now, the plane had shot through its go-around altitude of 2,300 feet. Seeing this, the captain finally pulled the thrust levers back to 83%. This had the dual effect of reducing the plane's acceleration and reducing the upswinging effect of the thrust from the low-hanging engines. Now, the captain was able to relax some of his forward pressure on the control wheel. Again, the first officer warned the captain about his speed, and the captain acknowledged it. Gradually, their situation was coming under control. The captain stabilized the speed and stopped climbing. This go-around was not the pilot's finest work. But it's worth pointing out here how quickly things happen during go-arounds. All the more so if the plane is light, as it was in this case, if maximum thrust is used, which it was here, and if there is a small difference between the height at which the go-round is initiated and the go-round altitude which is to be climbed to, which was the case here too. What's more, go-rounds are only routine in the sense that they are not emergencies, but they are not carried out that often, and most pilots encounter them in the simulator more than in real life. Under these circumstances, the pilots of Flight 981 didn't do too bad of a job. Importantly, they had gotten away from the ground quickly, which is the whole point of the windshear escape maneuver. The first officer received clearance from air traffic control to climb to 1,525 meters, or 5,000 feet. Climbing through 3,700 feet, the captain engaged the autopilot, and shortly after, the pilots retracted the flaps. The go-around was now over. Now, there was time for the crew to regroup and decide whether they should make another attempt. The controller cleared the pilots to a radio beacon known as Bravo Alpha and told them that they were second in line to land, behind an Aeroflot flight. Even though the hectic go-around was complete, the pilots still had their work cut out for them. They couldn't turn towards the radio beacon just yet, as there were dangerous areas of bad weather between them and the beacon. The captain and first officer used their weather radar to pick their way around the storms, staying out of the most severe weather. The strong winds were making this task difficult, as the pilots had to consider not just where the storms were now, but where they would be in a few minutes. The cold temperatures and high humidity also meant that icing was a threat. Even with the engine and wing anti-ice systems turned on, the pilots wanted to give themselves an extra margin of safety. The last thing they needed was for the engines to clog up with ice. To get out of the worst of the icing conditions, they asked the controller for clearance to climb to 8,000 feet, which was granted. At this point, the pilots weren't sure whether to attempt another approach or to wait and see if conditions would improve. It was possible that they had just gotten unlucky with the wind shear, and that it would be gone when they went back around to land again. So, when the controller instructed the flight to fly heading 230 degrees in order to set up for another approach, the captain refused this, saying that he wanted to hold at the radio beacon first and see what the Aeroflot plane did. If it made it in, then the captain would try another approach. But if it had to go around, the captain would hold off for now. This cautious approach was a wise one. Wind shear is a dangerous phenomenon, and with over 9 tons of fuel on board, Flight 981 could hold for hours if it needed to. Sure enough, as the pilots made their way towards the beacon, the controller radioed in, telling them that the Aeroflot flight had gone around due to wind shear. So it was settled. Flight 981 would enter the hold at the Bravo Alpha beacon and stay there until the conditions improved. The captain made a PA apologising to the passengers about the delay, and informing them of his plan to hold until conditions improved. This was an inconvenience for the passengers, but it was the safe thing to do. After a few minutes, the pilots turned northwest to find another area to hold in, as the Bravo Alpha beacon was now being inundated with bad weather and icing. As they flew, the controller informed them that the Aeroflot plane had gone around again due to wind shear. Clearly, this wind shear was not going anywhere. Now the question was, would Flight 981? Their diversion airport was Volgograd, about 200 nautical miles to the northeast. The pilots reviewed the weather for the airport, and conditions there were better than they were at Rostov. If they diverted now, they would be on the ground in no time. However, with over 2 hours of holding fuel still in the tanks, the captain was eager to wait until it became possible to make another approach into Rostov. Diversions are a major hassle for airlines. If the captain diverted, FlyDubai would have to arrange for overnight accommodation for all of the passengers and crew, and then arrange for transport to Rostov. They would also have to get the aircraft back to Rostov for the return flight to Dubai, which would be costly and would likely cause delays. The captain's main task, after all, was to deliver the passengers safely to their destination. If he could just wait in a holding pattern until conditions improved, all of these issues would disappear, and the only problem would be the inconvenience of arriving behind schedule. As the crew discussed their options, they were finding it increasingly difficult to get out of areas of icing. They requested a climb to flight level 150, about 15,000 feet, which was approved. The controller then cleared them to enter a different holding area to the southeast of the airport, away from the worst of the weather. As they made their way there, they requested more up-to-date weather information from the controller. He gave them the updated weather, which was an improvement on the previous conditions. This was in keeping with a general trend since they had completed their go-round, with conditions gradually getting better. However, as the pilots headed towards this new holding pattern, they got more bad news. The Aeroflot flight had now gone around for a third time, again due to wind shear. What this meant was that for more than an hour, wind shear had been present on the final approach to Rostov. However much the weather had been improving otherwise, any amount of wind shear was a no-go. At this point, a cabin crew member had come to the cockpit to ask about the delay. The captain told them that he had seen the runway on the last approach, but that he had been forced to go around because of the wind shear warning. Clearly, he explained, the warning had been correct, because another aircraft had gone around 3 times due to it, but nonetheless, based on his experience controlling the aircraft, it should have been more than doable to land the plane. As the pilots approached the holding pattern, they set a speed of 210 knots on their autopilot. At their current weight, this speed gave the lowest drag, minimizing fuel consumption and thereby maximizing the time they could hold for. The crew took up the hold at the Mike November beacon, and the captain contacted the airline via the plane's satellite communication system, or SATCOM. Meanwhile, the first officer monitored the weather at Rostov. In their discussion with the captain, the airline recommended the Mineralny Vody Airport, 270 nautical miles to the southeast, as the alternate, as it had more stable weather than the initial alternate of Volgograd. Just in case the captain did decide to divert there, the airline filed a flight plan for the trip. They also provided the pilots with the route they would need to fly there, and calculated the flight time of 44 minutes and the fuel needed as 1.7 tons. With that, the airline recommended that the captain hold for as long as possible and try to make it into Rostov if he could, and only then to divert. The captain agreed with this, and told the airline to get back to him if conditions worsened at Mineralny. The pilots now began setting up their flight management computers for a diversion to Mineralny, and they reviewed the approach charts for the airport. Once everything was set up, all it would take would be a few button presses to send the plane to its alternate. But landing in Rostov was still, by far, their preferred option. The captain went through the wind shear escape maneuver with the first officer again, so that it would be fresh in their minds if they had to do it on their next approach to Rostov. The pilots had now been holding for over an hour and a half. Conditions had improved slightly, and they decided that now would be as good a time as any to make another approach. The controller cleared them down to 8,000 feet, and the pilots began descending. As they would be landing at a weight of 54 tons, they calculated that their approach speed would be 133 knots. This time, they correctly calculated the safety margin, giving them an approach speed of 153 knots, a full 20 knots on top of the baseline speed. Given the difficulty they had had in maintaining altitude and speed the first time round, the pilots asked the controller if this time, if they had to go around, they could climb not to 2,300 feet, as the procedure dictated, but to 8,000 feet. This was approved. The controller then cleared them to descend further, and this time the pilots set the QNH correctly on their altimeters. So far, this was shaping up to be a much better approach than the first one. As the pilots descended below 4,000 feet, they again encountered the turbulence they had been warned about. Everybody in the cabin was strapped in and eager to get on the ground after nearly 2 hours of waiting. The captain continued decelerating, and the first officer began extending the flaps. Before long, approach control once again cleared Flight 981 for the ILS approach to runway 22 at Rostov. Flying on autopilot, the plane intercepted the localizer, the lateral component of the ILS, and it began tracking towards the runway. Shortly thereafter, the glide slope came down to meet it, and the plane followed it down. The captain monitored the flight path through his heads-up display, while the first officer used his primary flight display. Conditions were blustery, and the plane's airspeed fluctuated as it flew through gusts. However, the approach was stable. As they descended through 2,200 feet, the captain disconnected the autopilot, just as he had done the first time around. A few moments later, he disconnected the autothrottle as well. The captain was slightly fast, but he was still within the tolerances for what is known as a stable approach. At any moment now, he would see the runway through his heads-up display, and would be able to continue the approach half visually and half using his instruments. At one point, the captain began to get slightly high on the glide slope. He began correcting this by pushing the nose down a bit. However, in tandem with this, he pushed the throttles forwards as well. This lower pitch, combined with an increase in power, caused the speed to increase. Then, a gust of wind caused the airspeed to jump from 153 knots to 168 knots in just 1 second. Over the next 2 seconds, it jumped further to 176 knots. The first officer called out, "Check the speed." This was way too fast for the approach to be considered stable, and the captain immediately called for a go-round. This was windshear. He pushed the throttles to full power and began easing back on his control column. However, some confusion was now about to take place in the cockpit, which would soon have dire consequences for the flight. The captain didn't tell the first officer that it was his intention to carry out the windshear escape maneuver, which involves keeping the gear and the flaps extended. This was the maneuver he had carried out the first time round, and it was the one he had briefed before beginning the descent a few minutes previously. Rather, he simply called for a go-round. It was understandable that the first officer thought this was meant to be a normal go-round, as he had just drawn the captain's attention to the plane's airspeed, showing that it didn't meet the criteria for a stable approach, which itself is cause for a go-round. But in the captain's mind, this sudden increase in speed was clearly a result of windshear, meaning that the windshear escape maneuver was more appropriate. Unclear about which maneuver the captain actually wanted to fly, the first officer asked if the captain wanted him to retract the flaps to 15 degrees, which would be standard for a normal go-round. The captain agreed to this. This was a deviation from standard operating procedures, which dictate that the pilot flying must be the one to call for flaps and gear, not the pilot monitoring. The first officer then announced that they had a positive rate of climb, which spurred the captain to call for the gear to be raised. This was the first sign that the captain was no longer in control of the situation. In fact, from this point on, he would simply be reacting to events as they unfolded, and they were now going to unfold extremely quickly. Now, the pilots were climbing away in a light aircraft with the engines roaring at full thrust just like last time. Except crucially, this time, they also had a reduced flap setting of just 15 degrees and no landing gear hanging down. What this meant was that they were experiencing way less drag than before. They were essentially in a streamlined aircraft, as they confusedly carried out a hybrid of a windshear escape maneuver and a go-round. This maneuver was something the captain was simply not ready for. He was sure that he could make the approach and landing this time, after 2 hours of holding. He just wasn't expecting to have to go round a second time. The first officer told the tower controller that they were doing a go-round, and the controller handed him off to radar control. Given the massive increase in thrust from the engines, the nose of the plane swung up. The captain had to push hard in his control column to stop it from rising further, exerting as much as 23 kilograms of force on the controls. And he had to do this with just one hand, as his right hand was on the throttle levers, keeping them fully forward. Now with his attention on what was fast becoming a very physical battle with the aircraft, the captain mentally began to fall behind the plane. It was flying him, rather than the other way around. As the aircraft climbed rapidly, he struggled to maintain a constant pitch of 15 degrees, as he had been trained to do. Rather, the pitch started varying significantly up and down. Rather than positively controlling it, the captain was merely reacting to what the aircraft was doing. The passengers were pushed into their seats as the plane roared skywards, accelerating rapidly as it did so. The first officer urged the captain to keep the pitch at 15 degrees. The captain raised the nose to 18 degrees, and then, in an overwrought effort to get it down to 15, pushed the control column halfway forwards. The nose dropped to just 4 degrees above the horizon, and for a moment everyone on board weighed less than half of their normal weight as the plane's climb slowed. As the pilots were raised out of their seats, the captain's right hand, which was on the thrust levers, involuntarily moved back, bringing the levers slightly back, before he restored power to them again. Really, he should have had them at a much lower power setting. Full power was totally unnecessary given the plane's weight and configuration. But at this point, both pilots were so concerned about the plane's erratic pitch that they had lost all sense of its airspeed. This was a dynamic and stressful environment for the pilots, not least because it was 4:30 in the morning for them, a time when alertness and performance are at their worst. They had just spent 6 hours in the air, the last 2 of which under a heavy workload. And all of this when they had fully expected to be able to make it in. When the captain pushed the throttles forwards and the aircraft started accelerating, it was as if it was accelerating out from under him, away from him, and he couldn't catch up. Already, the aircraft had reached 200 knots, the limiting speed for flaps 15. For the second time on this flight, the automatic flap retraction software kicked in, and the flaps retracted from 15 degrees to 10. The pilots didn't notice this, and with the engines still at full thrust, the lower flap setting now enabled the plane to accelerate even faster. Both pilots now had tunnel vision. Startled by the powerful G-forces they were being subjected to, and by the suddenness with which the aircraft had gotten away from them, their attention had now narrowed to just one aspect of the plane's situation, its pitch attitude. The plane now rocketed through 3,300 feet, its airspeed increasing through 210 knots, and its engines at full power. All the captain needed to do to regain control was to bring the engine power back and trim the aircraft so that he didn't need to push down so much on the control column to keep the nose from rising. But now, in an effort to reduce the pushing forces required, the captain began to do the latter of those two things. He pushed these two switches here, causing the horizontal stabilizer itself at the back of the plane to rotate. By doing this, the horizontal stabilizer would push the tail of the plane up, which would push the nose down, lessening the captain's need to use the elevators to do the same job. The only problem was that he held the switches down for an abnormally long time, 12 full seconds in fact. The trim is never meant to be used to change the pitch of an aircraft. Its purpose is only to maintain pitch changes the pilot makes using the elevators. What pilots are supposed to do is to use the control column to set the pitch attitude they want, and then trim until that attitude can be held with the control column at the neutral position. But the captain was not using it in this way now. Instead, he continued to hold the control column forwards, while trimming nose down at the same time. His horizontal stabilizer was now tilting back, pitching the plane further and further down, all while the elevator did the same job. As the plane went from a climb to a rapid descent, loose items in the cockpit were lifted up into the air. Everyone on board experienced 0G and then -1G, meaning that they were now hanging by their seatbelts, while anything not strapped down was flung violently to the ceiling. Luckily, the pilots had shoulder harnesses, but these forces were so extreme that they only heightened the captain's disorientation. Dust and debris in the cockpit lifted up and flew into the pilots' eyes and noses, making it harder for them to see and to breathe. The aircraft was now screaming towards the ground, its altimeters rapidly winding down towards zero. Its nose was 40 degrees below the horizon. Going downhill with the engines at full thrust meant that the airspeed began to increase rapidly. Under extreme stress, the captain became completely disoriented. He began reflexively pressing the rudder pedals left and right, something which could have had no purpose, as rudder pedals are rarely used during flight on commercial jets. The plane was now diving at 18,000 feet per minute, about 20 times the normal rate of descent on final approach. Despite the chaos, the first officer was aware of the true state of the aircraft, and he urged the captain to pull up. But so stressed was the captain that he couldn't hear him. At this point, it would have been possible to save the plane. If the captain or first officer had pulled up on their control column and brought the throttles back to idle, they would have been able to heave the aircraft out of its dive. But they were now being subjected to overwhelming physical forces, which they had never experienced in their careers, and which they had not been trained to deal with. Sensing the massive rate of descent, the plane's enhanced ground proximity warning system began urging the pilots to pull up. Utterly panicked, the captain yanked the control column fully to the left, and the aircraft banked quickly. The first officer was horrified at the story that his primary flight display was telling him as he watched the aircraft corkscrew towards the ground. He urged the captain to stop, but there was no getting through to him. In a last-ditch effort, the first officer pulled back on his control column, but it was too late. Travelling at over 600 km per hour, Flight 981 slammed into the runway at Rostov. Everybody on board was killed instantly. This accident exposed major vulnerabilities in pilot training, especially during high workload situations like go-rounds. To combat this, FlyDubai revised its go-round procedures, placing stronger emphasis on crew coordination, better pitch management, and appropriate thrust application. Additionally, training was expanded on the manual stabilizer trim system, ensuring that pilots know how to use this system properly in a range of flight conditions. One major focus of improvement was the enhancement of upset prevention and recovery training. Crews now undergo more rigorous simulator sessions that simulate complex go-rounds from various altitudes and weather conditions, something which was previously underrepresented in training. These improvements, many of which were implemented ahead of regulation, reflect a critical lesson in modern aviation. In high-stress situations, mistakes become even easier to make, and once mistakes are made, it becomes easier to make even more. The solution to this is comprehensive training which reduces errors in the first place and prevents them from snowballing into situations where recovery is impossible. Discover who you are with MyHeritage. Use my link in the pinned comment or video description to get a 14-day free trial. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video.